Why We Fight by Interfectorem. Warning: this story contains suggestive topics and language some may find uncomfortable, as well as mild racial themes in the intros, in order to better show some of the story's underlying themes later on. Also, skip the intro chapters if you are more interested in the character's life as an NCR trooper than you are with his upbringing. I intentionally made it to be read without the intros, and still makes sense. Although, some of the smaller details later on may be referenced in the intros. Intro 1. Ed Hailong. We'll hit the ground running here. My name is Ed Hilng, typically pronounced Hailong, and if the name wasn't a giveaway, I am black. I was abandoned as a child, or lost my parents to inevitable circumstances like so many other kids before me in this wasteland. But I was fortunately picked up by a couple of she-fishers near the docks of San Fran. I was far too young to know exactly what happened to my parents, but the two Chinese descendants who walked me off that wharf say the burlap bag I wore as a shirt had the letters ED painted crudely on the front in black. No idea why I was wearing that shirt or what those letters stood for, but I was about 3 years old at the time and didn't know what I was ever doing. The Asian man and his buddy walked up, asked me things I don't remember, but were probably along the lines of "Where are your parents? And what are you doing out here?" I can't tell you what I said, if they were speaking English, or if I could even talk at that age, but I was taken home by one of the men and introduced to a harsh but fair woman who I still call Mama, but with a little deeper tone now that I'm older. From there, I was given the name Ed and then given the formal title of Hilng. I would have assumed that the last name given to me was that of my adoptive parents, but they went by Zhang. When I was a little older, I asked what my name meant since my parents refused to teach me Mandarin, Shi, or whatever they spoke. I honestly still don't know. Turns out that my last name was given as a form of joke between Mama and Pop that meant Black Dragon. I suppose they wanted to cover all the stereotypes and put them on me. So, who would you say I am? I am Ed, the Black Dragon, the orphan black kid with stereotypically strict Chinese parents. Anyways, I grew up as normally as an orphaned kid who was adopted by Chinese American parents would in this post-nuclear world. I grew up knowing fish, and did so alongside my pop. The parents were smart and taught me everything I needed to know, and all the customs of the Shi who ran San Francisco. I always used to ask if I was going to be offered to the Shi for work or research as I got older. However, I was always met with the same reply from Pop: "You are strong, Ed Hilng, but the guardians of the palace don't trust adopted round eyes, regardless of color." That never surprised me. All my friends were in the Shi, but they always referred to me as Round Eyes or Black Dragon in a way that assumed my status in San Fran, even though my friends called me those things good-heartedly. The Shi were good and all, but they had some traditions that were unchangeable. So, I fished with my pop, had no real future in the society I grew up in, but stayed the heck away from those hobologists whom everyone in San Fran said to avoid. I was a little older than 16, and the year was 2274 when I got to meet the new man whom my pop and his crew sold to. I knew we sold our fish to the locals and shops, but the man who offered to haul our excess away from San Fran was a slim fella of similar tone, but more age, by the name of Jed Masterson. Jed worked for a little caravan company out of Sacktown in the Northeast. So, I had to help my pop haul an excessive load of crates to the new trading gang in the market, and Pop called me up. Pop had some urgent business to take care of with the local Mr. Fung and told me to mark the accounts. My pop was subtly implying that Mr. Masterson and I would better understand each other due to our shared physical characteristics. Turns out, Pop was right, but not for that particular reason. Mr. Masterson and I took care of the business, loaded each other up, and spent the time to spare chatting away. Having never stepped outside of San Fran my whole life, at least that I can remember, I asked about the caravan business. I hardly even heard him. I just dreamed about the idea of going anywhere away from the salty air and overcast sky that seemed to permanently characterize the San Fran area. By the end of it, Mr. Masterson gave me his card and told me to sign on with the Happy Trails caravan if I get my pop's permission. I swore that I'd join the caravan the next time he was in town. All I had to do was convince my parents who lived for their strictness. "Absolutely not," said Mama and Pop simultaneously. "But I can make good money." "See the world," said I. Pop sat silently while Mama said, "No, no, no, fish is good money. Walking out there is too dangerous for you. Stay with us and help she." I scoffed and replied, as if San Fran is safe. "My buddy Lee got jumped by some of those hubologists last week, and Kuo got himself thrown off the tanker. That fool almost drowned in the bay." "You stop that language, Ed. You don't shout at your mama." I apologized for my use of the word fool and tried to reason. I asked Pop, "You want me to help you fish forever? There's got to be more out there than life here. Not even to mention that the she won't have me, and the hubologists are too silly. I could try to get in with the vagrants if you think that would be best." Mama said, "No, you are terrible with instruments." I sat silently at that. I heard the vagrants were looking for a bass player for a while, but I hadn't volunteered for their band, and Mama was correct. I finally looked to Pop, who sat there thinking. He finally looked up and I asked, "Didn't you do some traveling back in the day?" The old man glared at me for a moment and then caught eyes with Mama for a second before looking back at me and saying, "Yeah, long ago I did, but I stopped when you were left on our doorstep because your mother said, 'The world is too dangerous for this boy,' just before dying and leaving you with me." "You're full of it," I said, and then continued, "That ain't what happened. You said you found me on the docks." Pop ignored my curse. Then he stared at me with a facial expression that said how I missed the point through the lie. He said in a stern tone, "The world is very dangerous, Ed. You are far too simple for it out there." I knew my parents always considered me dumb, even when I did something smart. I'm not some scholar, but as I said before, I learned everything I knew from my parents who were smart themselves. I speak proper enough English, and no manners, and reading better than most G members my age. Still though, I learned long ago that nothing I did was ever good enough in the eyes of my parents, something that really ticked me off. That philosophy worked well regarding preparedness, and that helped Pop and myself time and time again during the storms that rocked the Bay Area or times of poor market sales. Although, I never thought my Pop would tell me that I was too simple for the world outside, especially considering how old I was at the time. That little statement during this talk atop a life of belittlement hit me a bit harder in that moment than it normally would have. Too exhausted from the day, I finally gave up and said, "Fine, I give up. I'll just fish for the rest of my life and die an old man here under your roof." To which Mama replied, "No, you won't. Your Pop didn't pull a little orphan off the docks to raise a quitter." Startled by the sudden 180 in positions and returned to the truth of my origin, I just sat there at the table. Pop then slammed his fist on the woodtop and said, "I've had it with your constant moping and complaining. Poor me, poor me. When Mr. Masterson comes back to town in 2 weeks, you are getting on that caravan, or so help me." I was just as confused as you are. Not sure if this was a trick, I let out a subtle, "You can't make me," under my breath. Pop then slammed his fist on the table harder and said, "We're done. Go to your room. Look what you did to your mother, making her cry like this." Mama sat there stone-faced and glaring at me without hint of a single tear on her face. I was certain I won the argument, but somehow they made me feel like I lost it as I ran down the hall of the shack and slammed the door to my room. I was going to work the caravans, apparently. Days later, and nothing changed life-wise. I still fished with my Pop and his crew on the San Fran docks and on his vessel in the bay. I wanted to ask Mama and Pop why they changed their minds and let me do what I wanted, while berating me at the same time. The thought that stopped me was the idea that they'd 180 again if I did that. As the 2 weeks before the Sacktown caravan arrived came to an end, I was questioned by both my parents about what I was doing to prepare for my caravan trip. I wasn't sure I needed to prepare. I was wrong when Pop told me how I was going to be worthless if I didn't do so. I then made up things I'd do, and counted out the money I saved for supplies at the dinner table. The last night before the Sacktown caravan came, and Mama and Pop sat across from me at the little wooden dinner table like every other night. This time was different only in that they sat without their evening meal, and they laid a piece of paper before me. The paper given to me by my parents was a literal contract. Before I could read the single paragraph, the front door opened, and Mr. Fung, the shop owner, came in. I greeted Mr. Fung, and asked the man from the table, "What are you doing here, Mr. Fung?" The elderly man didn't answer. He just silently took his place behind my chair, and Mama said, "Mr. Fung came to bear witness." Before I could say anything, my eye caught the bottom line directly below a signature line that said plainly, "Witnessed by Mr. Fung." On the left side of the paper next to the signature line was the official seal of the she, as well as a blank circle to the right side that I wasn't sure about. I was about to read the contract, but the official she stamp stood out to me, and I asked Pop, "Got all the bells and whistles for this, huh, Pop?" "Ha." "No joking," said Pop sternly, and then added, "Read the contract and sign." I read it, and I won't bore with the details, but it essentially said that I promised to hand over all wages I acquired with the caravan over to Mama and Pop. Then there was something that said I wasn't supposed to go to any other caravan spot aside from Sacktown. The last detail said how I was to head back from Sacktown immediately with the happy trails accompanying she observer named Xiang, an aging mercenary type. No time to think as the elderly Mr. Fung leaned on my chair for balance. I only caught the eyes of Mama and Pop, and when I did, Mama slid me a pen. I signed, leaned back, and said, "I'm really looking forward to it." "Not so fast, quitter," said Pop. "You didn't sign the circle." I saw the round circle on the right side of the signature line, and Pop was way ahead of me. Pop gave Mr. Fung a nod, and the old man fumbled for a long blade in his coat that he removed with shaky old hands. Mr. Fung grabbed my hand, sliced open the index finger rather roughly, and I dotted the paper with my blood. I got to do what I wanted now, only at the benefit of my parents. Still, though, I was grateful and intended to keep the word of everything I signed for. Since I signed an official she document, I knew that breaking the contract wouldn't be good and would likely be pretty painful, but I wasn't worried. The next day arrived. I did my work with Pop, gathered my bag of goodies for the road, and after hauling our excess to the caravans, I met with Mr. Masterson to depart. Intro 2. Not quite there. I did the caravan trail for years with Mr. Masterson and loved every minute of it. I learned a lot about leading the Brahmin, which routes were safe, and all sorts of other useful bits about life unavailable to the average San Fran fisherman. True to my contract, I walked the roads back with Xiang, the former she observer and mercenary. I never went further than Sacktown, and always handed over my meager pay to my Mama and Pop. Leaving the San Fran area was always something to look forward to, and helped make the day-to-day with Pop and the crew a little more bearable. I got really close with Mr. Masterson over the years, and not for the reasons Pop initially thought of. Mr. Masterson was very worldly, and loved going to San Fran. He had all sorts of questions about me, my life around she-protected fishermen, and what my opinion was on world events. I had no answers to the latter. I couldn't tell you anything about the world outside of San Fran, but I could tell you a lot about life inside it. Like I knew which she-thug was secretly getting with Sandy Green, the hubbologist and new Reno porn actress. Anyway, Sacktown was the only other place I'd been to at this point in my life, and I liked it. I didn't like Sacktown for any particular reason other than the fact it wasn't San Fran. Settled in the hills of the Northern California waste, the town was like others I'd heard about in that it was patched together on the ruins of an old world city. The place wasn't as big as San Fran, but it had its own distinctions. 3 major things distinguished it from San Fran, and those were, it served as a hub for a lot of caravans going north from places down south. It wasn't home to spiritual descendants of a Chinese submarine crew, crazy religious cuckoos, or vagrants stinking up an old tanker. Lastly, and probably most uniquely, it was part of some big country called the New California Republic. I heard about the NCR in passing many times throughout my life in San Fran, and none of them positive. When I first went to Sacktown, I saw the soldiers walking around the town in brown jumpsuit-style uniforms and strange brown pan-looking helmets. That first time, I asked Mr. Masterson about those folks. He told me how the place was still a military town and had been since their war with the Enclave. Like NCR, I'd heard about the Enclave. So, Jed went on to tell me how Sacktown still served as a big base for NCR operations in the north against tribals and the Brotherhood of Steel. I was familiar with the Brotherhood, but more on that later. As the years went on, I had more news from the outside than my parents had in probably decades. Although, my parents were less than interested, instead more focused on Gian, who lost a finger cutting fish while intoxicated, of course. I mentioned a few of my buddies I met in Sacktown who were in the NCR on multiple occasions, and was met with disdain from Mama and Pop. Their custom and upbringing forbid them from speaking ill about my pals I got to see twice a month, but that didn't stop them from speaking ill about the organization they belonged to. I never minded most of their griping, considering their knowledge of the world outside San Fran was more than 15 years old. Suppose I didn't have much of an opinion about NCR anyway. I was pretty sure they weren't tribal killers or land takers like my parents said, but I knew my buds over in Sacktown, and they were nice enough. They never called me Round Eyes like my buds in San Fran did, and they never called me Black Dragon even though that was the translation of my name. My NCR pals thought my name was hilarious at first, since it was so seemingly out of place or unique. All they did after that was buy me a cola and gab about nonsense at the Trader's Stop, a Sacktown bar popular with caravan hands. Things went smoothly for a long time, and the trips to Sacktown became more routine than anything. It even got to the point where Mama would give me a grocery list of things to purchase when I went. That would come out of my own pay, of course. Eventually, the year reached mid-2277, and I turned 19. I had just arrived in Sacktown with Masterson and crew when the town had a different tone to it. The NCR flag at the center of town was at half-mast. Me, Mr. Masterson, Zhang, and a few of the other caravan hands entered the bar we liked. It was too late for Zhang and me to head back home, and we liked staying a day or two. Again, just like outside, the whole tone was different. Caravanners drank quietly while the bar itself was packed with soldiers drunkenly telling incoherent stories through the chatter. I managed to find one of my buds in the NCR who went by, Corporal Wilson, and he was already too deep. I joined the soldiers at the bar and overheard all sorts of different stories about people who were close to whoever was talking. Corporal Wilson managed to collect himself a bit, and his drunken talk was turned into sobs as he recalled something that happened recently to his baby brother at a place called Hoover Dam. Not knowing anything about that place, and unsure of what exactly happened through the noise, his intoxication, and grief, I asked about it. All he said was that his baby brother was butchered by a bunch of savages. Hearing my mama's piercing voice in the back of my mind, I asked if Hoover Dam was someplace up north, and if his mama or pop was there to protect his baby brother. I suppose my attempt at sympathy would have worked better if I decided to chuck a brick at his face instead. No, Corporal Wilson's mama and pop were not there to save his baby brother. His baby brother was actually an 18-year-old soldier in the NCR Army serving in some place out east called the Mojave. I very quickly realized it would be best to let the soldiers I knew grieve over things with each other instead of a wildly ignorant caravan hand from San Fran. Returning to the table of Mr. Masterson, Zhang, and the others, they somehow pieced together more than I could from the soldiers themselves. Some big battle was fought out east that was ultimately won by the NCR, but with many killed and wounded. A lot of the troops in Sacktown knew someone, or served with someone who died there. Anyway, we spent the evening chatting with each other and giving the soldiers on the opposite end of the establishment some room. I got pretty buzzed myself, having just tried alcohol for the first time, hearing that it helps with the type of sad atmosphere plaguing Sacktown that night. The alcohol only made me sick, but I understood why everyone was sad after learning the reason. I found it interesting how the place I loved going to twice a month was turned completely upside down by a horrific tragedy so far away. There was something very admirable about the amount of care those troopers at the bar had for their pals so far away. That was something I didn't really know existed outside of families. The tone of the evening eventually got the better of me, especially because I wasn't ready for the impact of alcohol, and the whole trading gang departed the establishment. Mr. Masterson gave me my pay, and Xiang went to go rent the motel room we always shared. I told Xiang I'd meet up with him later, while I decided to take a walk, clear my head, and let the night breeze relieve my dizziness. I walked the nearly vacant streets of Sacktown, still feeling the winds and observing the quiet town. The only sounds were the wind through the dead trees of Northern California, the murmur of noise from the drinking establishments, and soldiers stumbling back to their base on the other end of town. I passed the empty streets of the trade district and just thought about life as all the noises grew further away. Eventually, I felt fine enough and was about to turn around to head back when I heard the only noise I heard in nearly 20 minutes. A man in the shadows dropped a box of nails followed by the accompanying swear word, "Shoot." He didn't say shoot. I approached the man and asked what was wrong. He said simply, "Hey, it's nothing. Just drop my nails." I asked, "What are you doing?" Shining a little flashlight on the ground and picking up the nails creeping towards the gutters, he said, "Just putting up the papers." He caught my eye and asked, "You heard about that big battle out east?" I explained I had, but he understood my ignorance about its significance. I was about to let him get back to work and head to the motel when I saw the poster he was putting up. I asked him to shine the light on it, and he did so. The big 4x5 poster was stuck to the wood side of the building and showed a man in the NCR uniform with a face covered by the helmet and goggles pointing right at me on a desert background. The bold print above read, "Nevada needs you. Civilization awaits." There was a lot of small text below, but I didn't have the energy to read it. I wasn't quite sure what to make of the poster, the Sacktown situation, or anything. I just headed back to the motel and towards the lowered flag at the center of town still illuminated by a floodlight. Not much changed following the big battle for Hoover Dam, at least for me. I'd come home with Xiang and then work with Pop on the docks or in the bay. I remember bringing up that battle a few times and got plenty of complaining about NCR and how they probably deserve whatever happened. Things trickled back to normal for me, but a few months after that incident, most of my NCR buddies were gone. Asking around the town, I heard a lot of them got pushed east to that Mojave place. None of that concerned me on my brief vacations to Sacktown, but I kept seeing more and more posters asking for people to join up and that the Mojave was in jeopardy. I had to ask Mr. Masterson about the whole situation in that far-off land, and he said he didn't know anything. All he could say was that the Mojave Desert was a long, long ways from us based on his old maps. More and more time passed, and nothing changed. I was effectively locked in my place of life, helping Pop and the crew fish, selling in the markets, eating dinner with Mama, and waking up early to do it again. My little vacations to Sacktown with Mr. Masterson and the she-guard who made sure I got home safe were the highlight of my life. However, after doing that for years, even that was starting to get monotonous. As the monotony set in, I really enjoyed getting caught up on the Sacktown news since I already knew more than I wanted to about the people in San Fran. Of course, since Sacktown was an NCR military town, all the news I read to keep my mind occupied was about that desert. It was really interesting to hear about a war going on so far from home, and reading about the politics of that nation my parents hated got me more interested in the world than it should have. Those interests in Sacktown had always followed me home, leading to strange conversations with the parents. Like, I remember asking Mama how San Fran could be neutral during it all. Pop always answered first by saying something like, "We're too far, and NCR can't drag she into any war." I asked about the wars up north before I was born. I heard a lot about that enclave because a lot of my old NCR buddies had fathers or mothers that served against them. I also learned all the bad things the enclave supposedly did, and that their main base after the ocean nuke was only 60 or so miles north of us. Pop verified all the horrible things that the enclave did, but when I asked why the she remained neutral, He said, they never hurt us, so why hurt them? That seemed like pretty sound logic, but then I asked about the Brotherhood's involvement, and he said, no skin off my back if a bunch of tin cans want to fight each other. My family. And the entity that dominated most of San Fran didn't care about anything other than fish, and whatever the she do in their palace. You may wonder where I stood, and the answer is that I didn't stand. At least not at this time. I did, however, learn a lot more about who the NCR was fighting after a trip to Sacktown in 2278. Most of those posters after the big push into the Mojave and immediately after Hoover Dam were about bringing civilization. It wasn't until around early to mid-2278 that I started seeing who exactly the NCR was against in that far desert. Apparently, there was a giant nation of monsters out east called Caesar's Legion. All the propaganda said how they used dogs to murder people, enslaved whole towns, and dressed up like, quote, low-budget Romans. I didn't even really know what a Roman was, but they sounded pretty scary if the pictures of masked men in metal armor nailing people to phone poles were based on any truth. Regardless, the posters and even visits to soldiers from the front told me more than I imagined. One of the NCR guys in Sacktown said he lost his leg because a horrible Legion dog from Denver ripped through it and needed an amputation. I remember being pretty convinced that this Mojave place was in jeopardy, and my NCR friends said the Legion could reach San Fran if things weren't done in the faraway desert. That was a pretty scary thing to hear. So one night in '78, I talked to Mama about it. I said, so, I saw another one of those mongrel posters in Sacktown last week. Those Legion mongrels sound pretty nasty. Sounds like they feed babies to them. Mama instantly said, you really believe that NCR bullish propaganda nonsense? What's the matter? I thought I raised you better than that. But people in the Mojave talk about towns getting swarmed by dogs and people getting nailed to telephone poles. I questioned defiantly. Mama, never being one to trust NCR in a million years, responded with, bah, Legion probably just likes puppy dogs. Leave it to NCR to make sweet puppy lovers into killers. Why you even talking about this? You like the NCR or something? I responded, no, not really. I got a few friends with NCR over in that desert, and it's just, those Legion guys sound kinda bad. Mama shouted, go join NCR then. Go kill and steal, and tell me how good you feel after killing 100 puppies. I said confusedly, no, never mind. That was it. I always knew to take posters and whatnot with a grain of salt, but after that conversation, I learned something. No matter what it was, NCR would always be bad in the eyes of my parents. Martians were abducting NCR citizens. They deserved it. NCR was fighting slavers. Those slavers were giving people purpose. NCR farmers experienced a raider attack. The farmers should have given over that shiny thing. Anyway, by the end of 2278, Happy Trails took a financial hit. They lost contact with some place called New Canaan, and my twice-a-month caravan trips were altered to only monthly caravan trips. Although, things were chugging along, and my life remained relatively unaltered for another year and some change. It was nearing the end of 2280 when things officially changed for me. Happy Trails was hit a little harder than expected with the loss of the New Canaan route, and things had been winding down for the company over many months. I learned a little more during that December of 2280 when Jed Masterson arrived in town a day early, asking to stay the night with us. Jed Masterson made his way in from the cold bay winds of December and took a seat by our fire. We warmed the man up, and he informed us that his other hands were staying the night in other residences. I asked Jed why he came in a day early, and he said, schedule's all messed up since most of the teams are behind. I tell ya, losing New Canaan was tough on the company, and things ain't been the same since. That's not even to mention the new cuts. He stopped himself. I asked, still with the schedule issues, and what's this about cuts? Jed looked at me through the fire and said, oh man, I didn't want to tell this to you directly, son. But the company is going under and had been a long time coming, but they're cutting the sand to sack route. Shocked, I asked the man, what? What about our fish? And Jed shot in, sorry kid. Even if they weren't doing that, I'll be taking off on a new trail. Company's working on finding other new routes and expanding to the Mojave. I was going to say something when Pop already determined my destiny. You will fish with me, Ed. It's about time you focus on the family. You miss good days of solid work when you take your monthly vacations. There was nothing to really say in defense or offense. Jed only said again, sorry boy. This next run will likely be the last one. The rest of the night passed by slowly, and Jed saw the sadness in my face, while Mama and Pop shrugged off my obvious despair. I didn't want to fish and stay in San Fran for the rest of my life. The next day came, we rounded up all the hands and loaded up to go. Along the way to Sacktown, the other hands noticed I wasn't joking and laughing like I usually did and inquired about what was troubling me. I stayed silent. I had too much to think about as I knew these were my last days of monthly freedom. Knowing the next years of my life were going to be stuck with the salty smell of the sea, and fish was not a happy thought. Days later, we arrived, and Mr. Xiang stuck with me as my escort back to San Fran. I suppose the aging mercenary wasn't suspicious of anything, and he had no real reason to be. But he watched me the whole trip, and didn't have to ask why I was in a pissy mood. We spent 2 days in Sacktown, and I wasn't able to enjoy any of it. I told my NCR buddies why I was upset, and they merely commented on the strange traditions of the Shi, of which I agreed with them. It got to the point where some of them told me about their own family qualms. Some of my friends were destined to remain at some Southern California farm with their families forever until leaving to join the NCR. Some were from rough neighborhoods in NCR cities and joined the army to get away from gang violence. Others had families going through bad droughts and left so that their younger siblings would be able to eat. There were those who volunteered for service to escape a chain gang, and those who joined up because they felt it was their duty to serve the nation that made their lives a bit easier. No matter where each trooper stationed in Sacktown was from, all of them loved each other's company, fought beside the other, and supported one another however they could, whether that was by covering fire in battles against slavers, or spotting a friend who was short of cash at the bar. Those troopers had 2 things I was never eligible for with the Shi or back home: real friendship and real purpose. I don't know what it was that made me do it, but on my last day in town, Xiang and I were packing up to go when I told him, I have to use the bathroom. He looked at me and said, okay, go ahead. I went to an outhouse just outside our motel, and I guess my plan was to wait in there until he simply decided to leave without me. Not surprisingly, I eventually saw his shadow under the door, and his voice asked, You all right in there, Ed? Stomach problems. Just go on without me. I'll catch up, I said, stupidly believing he might buy that. He said through the door, Look, Ed, I know you don't want to go back, but you can't stay in an outhouse forever. I'm also being paid by your parents to make sure you come home in one piece. I creaked the outhouse door open and told the man straight up, I can't do it, Xiang. Happy Trails is done with the sand to Sack route, and I might blow my brains out if I have to fish with Pop and listen to Mama complain about things forever. I still love them dearly, but I don't belong in San Fran. He was silent and watching me through the cracked door for a long time. He opened the door a bit more and said to me, You need money for a gun in order to blow your brains out. Confused by the statement, I said, Okay. The aging merc added, You'll be pretty short on cash when you pay me to look the other way. Granted, you won't be at home, so you may not want to blast yourself. So what next? I still didn't know what was happening, so I said, What? Xiang sighed. You always were simple. Anyway, look, you pay me your haul, and I'll tell your parents you ran off. Does that make sense? I suppose my face said it for me, but I realized that Xiang was a mercenary for the first time in my years of knowing him. I asked, What about your honor to the Shi contract? You can't look the other way for a bribe. You think just because I'm Asian and from San Fran that I'm a member of the Shi, he said accusingly, and then paused. I knew for a fact that he was a member of the She before becoming a mercenary, so I said as much. I know for a fact you're a member of the She. He laughed. Haha. I'm just pulling your chain, Ed. You should really wise yourself up. I won't be breaking my honor contract because you ran away. Growing up in my household, I never truly learned what sarcasm was. He didn't speak, but instead acted for me. He reached into my pocket, pulled the roll of NCR cash out, and said out loud, "Where'd Ed go? Guess I'll head home without him." I stood there in the outhouse doorway for a solid minute before it hit me. Xiang was slowly walking away, and I started to creep back into town. Just before I turned my back to Xiang, who was already walking away, he shouted from the distance, "Good luck, Ed." That was it. I paid the mercenary around 300 NCR bucks and was on my own in the city of Sacktown. Nowhere to go, and nothing to do. My mind raced for a minute as I headed to the only real part of town I knew to go. I couldn't find Jed, and he said he was linking up with someone for a trip to somewhere. Knowing he wouldn't be at the Happy Trails headquarters, I slowly walked to the trader's stop, the only other place in Sacktown I was really familiar with. I wondered what Xiang would really tell my parents, and more importantly, how they'd react. My parents were by no means rich, but I knew they'd spend every dollar or she coin they had getting a mercenary army or detective to track me down. The thought that they'd probably do that warmed me, but I still couldn't stand the idea of fishing in the Bay Area and being a she outcast for the rest of my life. I needed to get out of Sacktown and do what I abandoned my parents to do. See the world. Then I saw it, and a light clicked in my head. The worn building on the same block as the trader's stop had a big sign that said, "Recruiter." Author's note. This story and its style was inspired by Arthur Guy MP's World War I autobiography titled Over the Top, as well as some of my own personal military experiences. I hope this honors the message and theme of his service story, and hope everyone reading this enjoys it. Chapter 3. Ed Harton ain't neutral. I sat on a rickety stool in the office of an NCR recruiter after speaking briefly to a very large woman in trooper fatigues in the musty lobby. "He'll be there in a minute," she said, as the 20th minute arrived on the clock. I looked around the office at all the trinkets on the desk, all the propaganda on the walls, and memorabilia supposed to entice young wasters into joining the NCR Army. Suddenly, the man entered and took his place behind the desk, extending a hand to me as he said, "Come to join the armed forces of the old republic, have ya, Mr." I stood to do a short bow, but caught myself, and instead shook his hand as I wondered what to say. I don't know why, but I didn't think the simple question about what my name was would catch me so off guard. I knew the She disliked the NCR, but wasn't sure if the NCR would like someone with a She name trying to enlist in their army. Glancing around the room, obviously searching for inspiration for a fake name, I saw a little framed picture on the wall. The picture was of some man apparently called the Sun, with long hair, robes, and a big cross symbol behind him. The thing that stuck with me was the hand beside a heart-looking thing in the center of his chest. I finally responded, "Ed. Hart." Why couldn't I find the rest of my fake name? I unconsciously said it out loud. Heart on chest, heart on Sun, Hartenson. By that point, I caught the recruiter's face that showed concentrated skepticism. He stopped, motioned for me to take a seat. We did, and he asked, "So, Ed Harton, what's your actual name?" I caved, "Ed Hilng, sir, and no, Ed isn't short for Edward." He chuckled to himself, more shocked at why I'd try to change the last name rather than mockingly. He said, "Hey Long, huh? What is that? Tribal name or something?" I shook my head and answered softly, "No, sir. It's She, or Chinese, or Mandarin, maybe Cantonese. I think it's a mix of stuff." He had an eyebrow raised in an overly dramatic way and said, "No kidding. You don't look She." I responded honestly, "Well, That's because I'm black. I was adopted by a she family. He jumped in, and they gave you their last name. I shook my head again, and begrudgingly said, no, sir, their last name is Zhang. I've been through this conversation so many times with new people I met everywhere in Sacktown and the market back home. Needless to say, I knew what was coming as the recruiter asked, so, why are you named Hailong? Reluctant every time, I responded, Hailong means black dragon, sir. He was about to either cry in pity, burst out laughing, or both as I added, I guess my adoptive parents thought it would be funny to curse me with always having to explain my name. He surprisingly swallowed his humor at my literal joke of a name, and said, I suppose your folks are pretty creative. Anyway, Hailong isn't the craziest name I ever heard. What made you want to change it? At first I wasn't sure if NCR would enlist someone with a she name, but the man before me clearly didn't care about that, instead thinking my name was more funny than anything. I was about to agree to start the rest of the talk off with my real name, but remembered what my parents would do if they got someone to track me down. My name would stick out like a sore thumb on any list a mercenary or detective would happen across, so I realized I still needed a fake name. Not sure of what the NCR recruiters did with parent-contracted she runaways. I told the man, Hailong is too difficult to explain to everyone, just call me Harton. He said humorously, ain't the first time I had someone in here enlist under a fake name. Want me to change your first name to Edward, perhaps? I nodded, and he wrote down some information on a form. He then spoke idly as he filled out the rest. I mean, you will always have your real name. However, as of this form, according to the new California Republic, you are now Edward Harton. He turned the form around to me. I saw how my new name was spelled and gave the man a nod. Sounds good. I'm still going by Ed, though. He grinned and said, perfect, then looked up and added, date of birth. My mind instantly shouted, ah, darn. You can't tell him Year of the Rooster like some crazy person. Maybe my parents were right. I was too simple for the world, and it was all their fault. I shook the thought out of my head and replied, 2258. Before he could ask, I answered for him. Today. He wrote down my unofficial/official birthday, December 28th, 2258, and said, well, Edward Harton, you are now registered in the NCR census. Now, as to why you're here, why you want to join the NCR Army. Now that the difficult questions were out of the way, I thought about my parents, about my friends was something worth fighting for, and about my nowhere life that I just left. I said, because Ed Harton ain't neutral. Chapter 4. Bells and Whistles. I had to answer more questions from the recruiter that I don't much remember or care to detail. The only real question I remember was one asking where I wished to go in the Army. There were options to stay in the local area, because the NCR Army policed this territory, and I told him, nope, send me anywhere away from here. He jotted down some notes and asked me for my religion. I asked what that was for, and he said that some of this information was for my dog tags and service record. Before I could ask what dog tags were, he showed me a list of spiritual preferences for enlistees, and I looked it over. None on the list had any sort of relevance to the she's primary spiritualism that held the emperor above all. So, I was going to simply choose atheist until I saw the partially filled hubologist bubble. I looked up at the recruiter, who couldn't seem to understand what was wrong. He asked, you're from San Fran, right? Ain't you guys hubologists over there? I thought for a moment how funny his assumption was. Even though my family and every member of the she hated hubologists, I responded to the recruiter, yes indeed. I'm an AHS8 and proud of it. The joke went over his head. I finally figured out what sarcasm was, and according to the NCR military, I was Edward Harton, a San Francisco hubologist. After the forms were done, I was instantly taken to a back room where the recruiter kicked a man with red crosses on his arms out of his dream, saying I needed a physical. The doctor looked me over from head to toe, and prodded where I'd never been prodded before, stuck a stick in my mouth, didn't find what he was hoping for, and double counted my appendages. He took a Geiger reader and ran it up and down my body, and it turned out that I wasn't a mutant. After saying, "He's all fit for service," I was escorted out of there and back to the office. The recruiter had the very large trooper woman in the lobby make copies of the forms, and came back 10 minutes later with a form saying I was now a volunteer recruit in the NCR Army. I looked at the form, and then up at the man with a question. I asked if this was it, and he said it was. I asked what was next, and he was going to tell me something, but then stopped and seemingly changed his mind. Instead, he asked if I wanted to serve on recruiting detail before shipping out for training and whatnot. I asked what that involved. He said how a person with my unique background could be a great service with his office in rounding up Sacktown locals or traders for the Army. I declined that as soon as he said that I'd have to remain in Sacktown. So, he then told me that now he was going to escort me to the local garrison. Along the way, I asked what was going to happen there, and he said how I'd be given a gear issue, and then barracks while the other officers finished their collections. Me and the other recruits were going to march south to some camp near the Shady Sands capital of NCR for some brief training before being assigned to who knew where. At the gates to the Sacktown garrison, I was finally allowed inside after all those years, and was instantly recognized by some of my pals from the bars. They jeered me on, or said how Sarge drugged me. I wanted to go and chat with them about why I joined up. But the recruiter pushed me along to a long round building with patched walls apparently called a Quonset hut, and labeled S4. Inside, the board man took his feet off a desk, greeted the recruiter, or Sarnt, and the man behind the cage said how the recruiter caught another one. I stepped up to the cage, proudly introduced myself as Edward Harton, and was met with a raised eyebrow as the man spat a long stream of chewing tobacco into an olive green canteen. After his introduction, the caged trooper scanned me over as if sizing me up for a suit or coffin, walked to the equipment lockers, and started throwing trinkets through the opening as he called out what was being thrown. In the stack was a bulky brown jacket, 3 sets of tan coveralls, a utility belt, an ammunition belt, 3 canteens, one of which was the man's spittoon, 2 cooking cups, a brown backpack, a rolled-up mat, 5 undershirts, 6 sets of underwear, 5 rolls of socks, 2 pairs of tan boots, a mini shovel, a waterproof tarp, a bundle of rope, a set of clear and tinted goggles, a black bandana, a brown neck wrapping, 2 sets of boot wrappings or puttees, a tan baseball cap, a set of fingerless gloves, a set of thick wool gloves, a heavy padded leather chest protector, a blue steel helmet, a tan cloth helmet covering, and a sheathed 8-inch knife. I looked at the pile of things in front of me, and then looked around for the Brahmin that we were going to load this stuff onto. All I saw was the recruiter and the grinning man at his desk who said, "Come on, Ranger Rick. Let's go." As I walked with the recruiter, arms full of equipment, I didn't see where we were going until I found myself inside another building. I could tell we were inside a sleeping quarters based on the way the recruiter idled on, and by the way he talked about which bed was mine, as if I could see where it was. I dropped my gear where I felt was best, and saw several other troopers at the other end of the quarters talking with a man in brown or eyeing me. The recruiter finally extended his hand, said, "Welcome to the NCR Army, Ed Harton. I'm gonna run your docs to S1, and you have yourself a good one." He walked out the door, and that was it. The other soldier on the other end of the room followed the recruiter out, and I was left alone with the others for a bit. I was about to ask how long the others had been in for, until I learned they were just like me. Each one of the others in this barracks had at least 12 to 48 more hours in the Army than I had, so I knew to listen when they said what was going on. Apparently, we were waiting for a Sergeant Cantor member to take us to chow. He was the trooper who followed the recruiter out. Sergeant Cantor member was essentially the babysitter for the new recruits about to head south for training. Luckily, I didn't have to wait too long since the last round of last-minute conscripts was supposed to finish around 12 p.m. the very next day. After that, we'd start the march south. After eating, Sergeant Can't Remember took us back to the barracks where he covered NCR history, military terminology, and basic military things like how to stand, how to salute, proper wear of the uniform, etc. That night, I wondered why everyone didn't join the army. I got free food, free water, free clothes, and learned some neat stuff from that sergeant. Being ignorant and dumb, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, we were largely left alone and spent most of the time idling around or practicing what we learned from the sergeants as others in my place came through the door. When 12 p.m. came around, there were around 25 of us and a new sergeant. A sergeant what's his name came in with 8 rifle-carrying troopers telling us to get outside. The troopers ordered us around, having us fetch Brahmin, load up harnesses and saddles, strap bags to them, and had us fill the crates or bags with supplies. Luckily, I knew a lot about dealing with Brahmin from the caravan, so I helped my pals load up lickety-split. Before the sergeant knew it, we were done, and he led the way forward with us recruits in the center of the train, and the armed troopers keeping pace in different spots along it. I was finally leaving Sacktown, as well as the San Fran area. By this point, I knew that Xiang would have been almost halfway to San Fran, and I wondered what Pop and Mama would think if they saw where I was and what uniform I was wearing. South of the North. I didn't mind the march south as much as the other recruits. I didn't really mind the orders given, and their tone either. I suppose I was used to being talked to like I was an idiot and being reprimanded for things that weren't even my fault. That wasn't saying the trip was horrible. I found it fun to learn all these new military things that were frequently taught at the various rest stops. The food was decent for a caravan hike, and the sergeant stopped leading the train periodically to fall back and teach us a bit of knowledge or quiz us about things we already learned. I won't talk about every bathroom break on the way to Camp Seth, but we arrived at the place after about 4 or 5 days of walking. I remember thinking about Mama and Pop, probably trying to find mercenaries to search Sacktown around that time. That also happened to be the last real thought I had about them for a while. At the camp, I saw the NCR capital of Shady Sands in the west, and the road led to a bazaar outside the walls that seemed busy, even from the distance. That day, we checked in, got assigned to a training company, and then it was time for some real training. I'll keep it short by saying the next 4 weeks were pretty okay. There was a lot of yelling and shouting in the first 2 weeks, as well as a lot of exercise and learning things. Most conscripts and volunteers were fairly used to basic survival and whatnot from years on caravan roads or simple life on farms or in frontier towns, so most of the training was focused on discipline and military parade or custom. Formations, marching, and uniforms was most of it. But week 3 came around and we spent that whole week learning the function and shooting of the NCR's standard issue service rifle. The thing was a fine-looking semi-automatic weapon with a gray metal receiver, carrying handle and wood foregrip and stock. I never shot a rifle like that, or any other in that case, so I was pretty excited to give it a go. I always saw Xiang's shiny .44 pistol and asked to try it out many times over the years, but he was told specifically by my parents not to let me do that. Either way, shooting the service rifle was really fun. In fact, I was so excited to shoot it that I missed most of the targets on each range. I wasn't the worst shot in the recruit platoon. A farm girl from east of Sacktown held that title, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. After the qualifications, I was given the Marksman Medal, which was essentially a participation trophy, and designated as a standard trooper infantryman. Some of the better shots in the platoon were tested with the service rifle, and then shown the bolt-action hunting rifles for testing with those. The recruits were designated to different weapons based on their skill level, knowing that I could occasionally hit the broadside of the barn. I was issued that service rifle under the assumption that if I didn't have to manually reset a firing pin, I might be able to hit some of the NCR's enemies in a real fight. The day I became a private, the formation was given our dog tags as the formal christening. I looked at the thing handed to me by Staff Sergeant Cantsay and read it. Edward Harden. Service number 3947354, and on the back was an HUB for Habologist. After that, the recruit platoon was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Regiment, 4th Northern Conscripts Battalion. I Wouldn't have minded if they didn't say that the new privates were going right back to Sacktown. I then made a fuss with S1 proclaiming that I wasn't a conscript and voluntarily joined in order to fight for NCR. In other words, to get away from San Fran. I was asked by the lieutenant there if I meant that I wanted to volunteer for the Mojave deployment. I knew what the Mojave was from friends in Sacktown, but had no idea where it was other than east, so I said, "You betcha." The admin man said that the 4th Regiment, 2nd Battalion of Home Guard Infantry was coming up from the hub in Junktown and would arrive at Camp Seth in the morning. I could and would join them. I always heard that NCR bureaucracy was slow, but my transfer was immediate. This was apparently because the NCR just established a new foothold in the Mojave and new troops were needed to man it. I was asked if I was sure I wanted to go, and I said once again, "You bet." Straight to the fray. I said goodbye to the few pals I made in training who were headed back north, and was shown to a barracks room to stay the night in. I slept well, and felt proud of becoming a private in the NCR Army. When the sun came up, I awoke to the noise what sounded like many people that just arrived. An admin corporal knocked on my door, and I headed out to the plaza, where the troops were restocking their Brahmin for another march. I was introduced to a Lieutenant Stanton of the 2nd Battalion Home Guard Infantry's Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon. The weary beret-wearing officer walked me to a Sergeant Lester, who was one of the squad leaders, and told of my transfer to his group. He noticed the marksman marker still pinned to my chest protector and frowned. I guess I wasn't the most prestigious trooper to join his squad. I was shown to the other 6 soldiers in his team and introduced myself. Everyone was nice enough, but seemed more tired from the marching than anything. I asked some of my rougher-looking new mates what the Mojave was like, but none of them had ever been there. This entire battalion had not yet been to the Mojave. They were busy policing the southern NCR while the rest of the regiment was moved to the Mojave. 2nd Battalion was only called up due to some recent events out there that ended up making the need for more troops. With all that, the battalion was nearly finished resupplying, and we marched out the gates going east. I barely had time to even see the NCR capital as we marched through the supposedly famous bazaar and past the city itself. This unit marched far quicker than the train from Sacktown. However, I kept up, bearing the weight on my back, and only really had time to get to know my new mates at the rest stops. I again won't bore whoever is reading this with every new blister formed on my feet, or every idle chat I had during a water break. But we went far east, and then south over many days, until we reached an old world highway called I-15. Although, I will mention one thing that probably isn't talked about too often by those less familiar with the way the NCR Army operates. This would be brought up by soldiers frequently later on when more conscripts are taken in, but the few weeks of training isn't all that the NCR soldier got. My training in a predominantly volunteer infantry platoon from Sacktown was given the 4 weeks of training, whereas conscripts would only get 3, and later 2 when things really heated up. Like I said, that may seem light, but during the march to the Mojave was where I actually got a lot more training. The long marches across the wastelands could take days, weeks, or even months depending on the location the unit was headed. That meant that there was ample time for troops, especially new troops like myself, to learn more that couldn't be taught at Camp Seth. In fact, it was on the march to the Mojave that I learned my explosives training, learned how to throw dummy grenades, how to patrol a road, and got the basics of first aid. During the stops in the evening for camp, or during a water or rest break, if a trooper made it known to his corporal or sergeant that he or she was deficient in a skill, training would occur during that time. Anyway, it was upon following the I-15 where we were told to remain on the lookout for Brotherhood raid teams. I asked my new pal, Private First Class Don, who they meant by Brotherhood. He told me that the Brotherhood of Steel had been hitting caravans and NCR troop columns across I-15 for years. I asked if he meant the Brotherhood of Steel, and he confirmed. I didn't know the Brotherhood did that. I used to walk by their bunker in San Fran sometimes and marvel at their shiny armor. They've always been on decent but distant terms with the Shi and people of San Fran. Although, I did recall mention of their war with NCR from my soldier friends in Sacktown, and even Pop and Mama, but never thought they hit caravans this far from the world. I said to Don and some of my other new pals that if they hit us, I'd be fine since I was close with the she. But PFC Dawn took another look at my physical appearance and laughed at the apparent joke. Walking into more blistering heat in full gear, I thought about the propaganda posters back in Sacktown and wondered if I'd get to see this legion that was supposedly swarming the Mojave. We were never assaulted by Brotherhood members, and the 200-man battalion reached a big staging area for forces about to enter the Mojave. We proceeded forward, and towards two giant men shaking hands in the distance. I was told that site was the Ranger Unification Monument, and signified the end of NCR lands, and beginning of the wild Mojave wasteland. We marched towards the Mojave outpost, but were stopped by the border guards. The whole battalion idled around, ate, or drank for a bit while the battalion talked with the outpost command. Just a few days prior to our arrival, there was some big incident a few miles north, where a bunch of prisoners escaped. The road was locked down for replenishment squads, but our unit was an entire battalion with 200 troops and our own orders, of which I was ignorant of. Some of us were curious if our battalion would be assigned to fix up that prison situation, since we were the only massed force in this region. But no, our battalion's orders remained the same, and so the topic was forgotten as we were told to set up camp. We set up the tents and stayed the night at the outpost since it was getting late, and I got to know a few more of my squad mates at the nice little bar the place had. When morning came, we entered the Mojave and marched down the old highway for a mile or two until veering off to the east away from the lockdown area. We passed a bustling little town called Nipton full of squatters, went up the road, and through some wide canyons to a town called Novak that was interesting to me because of the giant lizard monster statue at the center of it. On the third day in the Mojave, we continued onward towards an irrelevant, out of the way, and near desolate place recently called 188 Trading Post. I would be more descriptive of the whole Mojave situation, but there honestly wasn't that much to describe up to this point. I heard stories and saw the propaganda posters about raiders, legion, and monsters around every corner, but I mostly just saw a whole lot of sand, mountains, and nothing. Maybe it was because there were over 200 armed troops, spread out and marching as one into this part of the region, but nothing noteworthy happened. Like I said, all I saw of the Mojave during those first few days was the sand and podunk towns. Also, I was honestly a little more focused on the heat, the sweat beads trickling down my face, and the strap from my pack that kept snagging on the canteen pouches of my utility belt. Passing Novak, we stepped onto a wide old highway and could see a looming tower in the distance. I also noticed a different tower off to our left and was curious about all the excitement from the other troopers. I studied the tower off to the left, wondering what was so exciting about a big dull building in the middle of the desert. I mean, the thing was surrounded by a sea of reflecting and bright things. But I quickly realized that one off the highway wasn't the structure everyone was giddy about. I focused on the front of the march and looked at the other distant tower that looked like a big spire with a bit more building on top. Seeing the structure get closer and following the rising elevation of the highway, I saw more and more buildings beneath it. It was then that I started making sense of all the people who'd been talking about New Vegas for half of the trip. Troopers windedly pointed at the distant city, saying, "Look, there it is. I hope the battalion is assigned there." I personally couldn't understand all the excitement about a pre-war ruined city, even if there was a post-war town in it. I mean, I don't think a single person had seen the San Fran ruins and said, "Look, there it is," even knowing there was a large community in the old Chinatown district. So, I didn't get it. At least until the sun fell below the west and the lights came on. I'd seen San Fran at night, and even the NCR capital. Both were large cities for the world we lived in, and their lights were dim and spread for miles around. Each individual home with lights, whether lantern or electric, was quite the scene when there were hundreds of them together. However, there was nothing quite like what we were looking at on that third night in the Mojave. New Vegas sat in the middle of a dark desert, making the moonlight nearly irrelevant in the face of that bright neon beacon. I heard tales about gambling, prostitutes, and drinks on the march from other soldiers, but none of that really interested me when looking at the sheer light of the distant city. It almost seemed like all that light in the middle of the desert stood for whatever the person who saw it wanted it to be. The entire battalion looked at the spectacle with awe and the idea of infinite possibilities, But then the world smacked us all in the face when we were given the order to set up camp. We had arrived at the pathetic new trading post on the highway, 188 Trading Post. The place would become livelier over time, but at that particular time, this place didn't make sense when most caravans took the I-15 straight up to that big city. Nelson. When morning came, we packed up the camp and assembled as a unit while the morning caravan traffic or lost wastelanders came to the 188. After standing for far too long in traditional military fashion, the company commanders met with the battalion staff where they talked for many months and even decades, knowing that we wouldn't break formation. Around 400 years passed before Lieutenant Stanton of our platoon came back with Captain Palatli of Bravo Company with a good word. They got in contact with the NCR Mojave Command at Camp McCarran, who ordered the 2nd Battalion to disband. I didn't know where the other companies were going, but based on the uproar of cheering from Charlie Company, they were probably going to New Vegas. Alpha Company was fairly quiet, so I didn't know where they were going. As for myself and Bravo Company, we were assigned to the nearby township of Nelson. None of us knew exactly what that meant, but I heard muffled swear words from behind me, signifying the troopers of my platoon's jealousy of the cushy digs given to Charlie Company. Captain Palatli told the company our task, elaborated a bit, and soon enough, Lieutenant Stanton had us marching at the head of the unit back south towards Novak. I wondered why they didn't keep the whole battalion together, but I thought it might have something to do with the lack of replenishment squads still stuck at the gateway to the Mojave. I remember being assigned to perimeter security during the first part of our march back south, and watched the other companies head off in different directions when I was supposed to be scanning for hostiles. Wouldn't you know it? Charlie was heading north to New Vegas. I wondered where Alpha was going since I saw them head east. Either way, we headed south and I got another look at that other tower. The area around it was less bright than it was the prior afternoon, and I overheard some of my pals mention it being a solar plant occupied by our forces. I'd later learned the place was called Helios 1, and it would be one of our best neighbors far down the road. So, another hour or more passed before Bravo Company reached the turn off to the big lizard monster of Novak. But instead of going towards it, we started heading east. I wondered why they couldn't give the battalion the news about where this Nelson place was exactly, because the nearly 2 weeks of non-stop marching was taking its toll on me, and heading back south made things even worse. However, my feet had long since lost the ability to feel much. Pain just became normal, and every gripe was answered by a dehydrated sergeant or corporal saying to suck it up. Another hour or two marching away from Novak occurred down the old roads and through narrow canyons. We eventually reached an opening in the narrow road and stepped on a winding path leading down to a nice little town nestled in the hilly landscape. This was apparently Nelson. All 60-plus troops in the company set up camp around the town, while the townsfolk went about their business. Some came in from the cliffs all dirty, likely miners. Others traded goods with caravans, or tended to fixing up houses and planting crops in the dry soil. Once camp was all set up, the captain gathered up the company and explained what we were doing in this little old Western-style town. Our company was put there at the request of the people of Nelson due to frequent raids by the Legion from the south and east. Not being too far from the Colorado River, the Legion seemed to like picking on this place every now and again. The company was here to protect the town and run patrols along the river and into the southern hills to keep watch for those Legion fellas. My pals apparently got what they wanted. The troopers to my left and right loved getting word that their battalion was moving to the Mojave in order to fight the Legion. I suppose we were here to make sure the Legion didn't try any funny business. And I was just interested to potentially see if the NCR propaganda posters in Sacktown were true about all their evil. And see if Mama was right about the Legion being simple, puppy lovers. Weeks went by at Nelson, and much of what we did stayed the same. Nelson was by no means a large town, so the entire company being here to protect it was more than generous. When I wasn't busy doing patrols alongside Sergeant Lester, PFC Don, Corporal Madison, PFC Walters, and my other mates or superiors, we were free to roam the town, idle around, keep watch, search incoming caravans, or buy goods from the locals. The town liked us for the most part, except when the monthly tax collection roster was posted. I was lucky enough to be assigned to the first round of that pleasant job. Some of the people of town didn't know that signing on with NCR meant that they'd have to give away a portion of what they earned each month for the luxury of a whole company protecting their town. To be fair, I didn't know that either. I've had more than a few residents open the door smiling, only to slam it in my face when I asked as cheerily as I could, "May the new California Republic please collect our due taxes from you. After all, the troopers here need full bellies and enough ammunition to keep you safe." When the door slammed, a second knock would come, alongside 2 armed troopers kept in reserve for that situation. I thought that monthly monetary sacrifice would be worth it in the face of the Legion down south, but I guess not in the eyes of some residents. I mean, the Shi of San Fran offer protection to everyone in San Fran, minus the vagrants or hobologists. But I guess that was because they relied on the peasant fishermen and scavengers of the area for their food and resources. So, things went simple enough for a while, until one of the river patrols encountered a Legion raiding party crossing the river on multiple rafts. No deaths or injuries, just a few holes in the Legion boats before they turned themselves around. I wished I was part of that patrol. Anyhow, a week or 2 after that incident, Lieutenant Stanton passed down word from Captain Polatli about news from a ranger station south of us. The Legion's only bastion this side of the Colorado, called Cottonwood Cove, was getting more troops than usual and staying put. The place supposedly used to only serve as a staging area for Legion raid groups, but the concentration of troops had the Rangers nervous. It wasn't long before Captain Polatli was contacted by the Colonel at Hoover Dam, since we were technically under their command sector. I still didn't even know where Hoover Dam was, but apparently they were close enough to give us orders, and some of my fellas said it was miles north up the river. Anyways, the orders the captain got were to establish a fortification north of Nelson to better monitor the Colorado. Lieutenant Stanton's platoon was with the captain for the check-in with a fortification north of us. We hiked north of the town, through a flat valley full of shrubbery and long dead plants, up giant hills, and around ledges before reaching a pathetic little encampment of NCR fortifications in a cozy open nook on a ridge with a wide open view of the Colorado. Camp McCarran designated the sloppy little garrison as Camp Hope, and preparations were immediately made for bolstering the fortification after the reported increase in Legion activity to the south. For another 3 weeks, the Army caravans would come in and unload crates full of bags for sand, long poles and tarps for military tents, and supplies for the food, ammunition, and repair of equipment. Some of the caravan escorts even stayed behind to assist Bravo Company and man the fortification, while the troops assigned there helped turn the little outpost into an actual fortification. As the supply caravans arrived, each platoon would spend a few days up at Camp Hope, assembling tents, filling sandbags, making barricades, hauling in wasteland scrap for the walls, digging trenches, and setting out supplies. I liked when our platoon was assigned to camp construction. I thought it was sort of fun to build sandbag emplacements and set up tents. It almost made me feel like some sort of designer or town planner, determining what goes here and what goes there, with sergeant's approval, of course. So, when one platoon was constructing the camp, the other was running patrols or watching over the town of Nelson. Another week went by, and the bolstering of Camp Hope was nearly complete with organized rows of tents, walls of sandbags, large tents for supplies, scrap walls, observation posts looking out towards Nelson and the Colorado, and a few scrap shacks for more housing or other supplies. By this point, the amount of caravan escort troopers that stayed behind were enough for a platoon, but the new and improved Camp Hope had enough space for nearly a whole battalion. Once Camp Hope was almost completely done, Captain Polatli was told that McCarran was trying to rally enough bodies to man the place so we could focus entirely on Nelson. In the meantime, 2nd Platoon was contacted by some rangers from an outpost about a mile or 2 north of the improved camp. We didn't know that their place was so close, so Lieutenant Stanton asked Polatli to requisition some dynamite to blast a trail leading to the outpost, since the only real way into Camp Hope was from the south and up nearly 400 feet of winding paths. An alternate route seemed advisable, considering the east end of camp watched over the Colorado on a high cliff straight to the water, and the west end was a large rock wall with only a few person-sized paths. I thought it sounded like fun to use dynamite and blast away north. So, after the camp was officially done, We were still waiting on McCarran to send us enough bodies to man the thing. Like I mentioned, the 2 platoons of Bravo Company rotated between manning the nearly vacant outpost turned camp and protecting the town of Nelson. So far, I didn't mind my time in the army, and finally had time to think about Mama and Pop for the first time in a long while. I considered what we were doing out here, and how we'd help protect the town of Nelson. The people of that town seemed to like having us around, and loved having frequent customers with a steady army paycheck to pay for their goods or services. Aside from those who didn't want to pay taxes, the people of Nelson often said they slept much better knowing we were there to keep them safe. I felt good about what I was doing for them, and felt good about what I'd learned in my time with the army. Mama and Pop had nothing but resentment towards NCR alongside the rest of the Shi, and I don't think I would have turned out any different if I hadn't been introduced to them in Sacktown and my time with the caravan. My first taste. I don't remember, and I don't think I even knew the exact date at the time of the incident, but I know Camp Hope was done, and we still hadn't gotten the troops from Camp McCarran. Anyway, it was nighttime, and 2nd Platoon was heading down from Camp Hope to rotate positions with 1st Platoon. Heading down that awful winding path into the shrub-filled valley to Nelson was always heck on my knees, but we made our way across under the stars and reached the rocky opening into the outskirts of town. The residents were long asleep, and half of 1st Platoon was in the center of town, while the other half was nowhere to be seen. The members of 1st Platoon were lazing about, and we chatted with them through the cool breeze and cigarette smoke of the troops about whatever came to mind. Lieutenant Stanton looked around for Lieutenant Lloyd, but one of the troopers mentioned that he was out with one of the patrols, and the 1st Platoon members in the town center were still waiting for them to return. Lieutenant Stanton took charge and gave the order to the 1st Platoon members to head on up to Camp Hope, and we'd send their late patrols up as they came back. After that, we all took our posts around the town or went to sleep. I was of course assigned to first watch, and took my position watching the valley between us and Camp Hope with PFC Dawn. Everything was quiet until it wasn't, with the town silent as the grave, and the only real sound being the rustle of footsteps from distant corporals making the rounds. The posts south of us started shooting. Immediately, PFC Dawn and I stood completely still. We looked at each other as the roaming corporals rushed to see what was going on. We debated whether we should investigate or keep watch over our post. More gunfire ensued, and the sound of the corporal's footsteps was drowned by the popping gunshots. Suddenly it stopped. Dawn and I rotated between keeping watch over the north and looking back at the southern ends of town. We did that by the minutes for almost 5 minutes straight. I was looking back at Nelson when more gunfire erupted in the silence, but this time towards the center of town. The change in location of gunshots seemed more relevant this time, and the sudden terrified scream of a woman made the both of us whip around. We had to investigate. Approaching the town, Dawn and I walked cautiously with weapons at the ready, and I happened to notice the other sentries from posts were distantly moving towards the noise as well. Dawn and I leapt over a few fences, across the silent streets of town, and approached the door to an adobe building where Sergeant Lester and the other members of our squad slept. 30 feet from the doorway, it opened. My mind made it show the emerging figure was that of Sergeant Lester, but the faint light of the windowsill lantern and shout from PFC Dawn said otherwise. Dawn shouted at the towering silhouette, "Drop your weapon and get on your knees." It clicked in my mind that the shadowy figure with the plume of feathers across his abnormally large head wasn't in fact Sergeant Lester. It was the shadow of a propaganda poster person, and that thought made me raise my weapon. Before my mind could register what was happening, and before I could hear the increasing gunfire in town, Dawn let out a spree of shots from his service rifle. My brain told my finger to pull the trigger, but images of Dawn's rifle rounds going through the shadow and staining the wall behind flashed before me. Dawn had hit the demon what looked like 2 or 3 times, but there he was, pinning the young PFC to the ground. The moonlight showed the figure for who or what it was. A towering 6 to 10 foot muscular Arizonan clad in crimson tried forcing a knife into Dawn. I didn't think. My body only reacted for me as I thrusted myself onto the NCR propaganda figure. The weight of my body was enough to knock him off of Dawn, and my vision was a blur as I felt my arms collapse to tremendous pressure and a heavy weight on top of my chest. Maybe it was dirt in my eyes, or maybe my mind couldn't process what was happening fast enough, because all I heard was heavy demonic breathing. All my limbs felt totally immobile. And I felt the pouring of a liquid that soaked its way through my tan jumpsuit uniform. Not knowing what was happening, and unable to move freely, everything suddenly stopped when 3 more shots rang out that were close. The sounds of chaos still ensued in the distance, and the heavy weight fell dead on top of me. My mind caught up to the present, or perhaps I wiped the dirt from my eyes, because my vision came back, and I saw Don sitting there with his service rifle still trickling smoke out of the barrel. He sat there hunched over and collapsed shortly after I noticed him. I moved the heavy body of the Arizonan off of me and staggered over to Don. I then looked back towards the town and saw figures rushing away from it, occasionally turning around to fire upon more shadows. I instantly collected myself and tapped Don, who was slumped over. Under the light of the stars and smoke of distant battle, I said to Don as quietly and loudly as I could, "Get up, buddy. We gotta go." He weakly opened his eyes, clenching a wound on his abdomen and under his hands. He spat a bit of blood on the dirt next to him, devoid of energy, and said, "Can't Ed. Caesar got me pretty good." He was going to say something else when I heard voices echoing from the town, and I put my dirty hand to his mouth. I don't think he knew or cared what was happening because his hand slipped from his abdomen, revealing a dark stain even darker in the night. No words. I pulled up his rifle and slung it across my chest before slinging Dawn over my back. Trotting away from the town with Dawn on my shoulders, I heard voices in the rear and saw other shadows that seemed to outline our guys moving across the shrub valley towards Camp Hope. I think my mind went to a different place during that time because I again don't remember much of it. The pain in my ankles far later told me how I stepped in a hole or two as I carried Dawn, but my brain was elsewhere. At least until I sat with Dawn in the shadow of a ravine between Hope and Nelson. Gunfire from the cliffs behind us said that those at Hope were shooting at the figures around Nelson. I heard the noise, but facing away, I could see the menace around the town keeping their distance. I came to while watching the apparent legionaries move about the area they routed us from, and felt the weight of my buddy's head on my shoulder. Noticing his white face, I gave his cheek a decent slap and asked, "You still awake?" The man about my age opened his eyes as if he hadn't gotten adequate sleep and weakly groaned, "Yeah." He went to shut his eyes again. I slapped him again and said, "Stay awake, Dawn." I don't know why I said what I said next, but his face was almost blinding in the way it reflected the moonlight as I said stupidly, "If you go to sleep again, I won't give you my maize ration like I promised. Corn is your favorite." Dawn went to shut his eyes again, but there was a sudden crackle of gunfire far away that seemed to make them shoot open. He brought his hand to his belly again and felt the stream of blood that was getting thinner by the second. When he did, his eyes looked up, met mine, and tears poured from them as he asked, "Am I gonna die?" in a weak but frantic way that I can still hear. The way that simple question was asked made my own tears start forming in the moment. I'd never seen someone die right in front of me before, so the thoughts were too much, and I was still focused on the corn I promised him for whatever reason. I told the dying young man, "Die? Nah, you'll get some rest, and I'll bring you your chow every morning you're recovering, with my own maize ration too." My unintentional effort to keep his mind occupied or comforted didn't work. I was about to tell him how his little brother back home will be glad to see him return for recovery when his tears were pouring. Even more. My nearly dead pal used his little remaining strength creating more tears and saying, "I want my mom. Where's my mom?" over and over again as he choked on the words in short breaths. The blood poured from the wound and the stain on his clothes grew bigger and faster for several more seconds while I pressed his hands on it harder. No use at all. His last words escaped his lips nearly buried below the gunshots from the cliff behind us, and only loud enough for me to hear. You guessed it. Where's Mom? Then, like the giant pansy I am, I cried like a baby in that little wash between Camp Hope and the fallen town of Nelson. I'd gotten to know PFC Don and the other members of my second platoon squad pretty well over the weeks into the Mojave and time around Nelson and Hope. I'd mentally told myself multiple times that I wouldn't be too upset if the worst happened. After all, we knew the risk of joining an army, and I only knew these people. I wasn't related to them. Boy, was I wrong. I didn't see the fate of my sergeant and those who were asleep during Dawn and I's guard shift, but I saw Dawn's, and watching a pal die while crying to see his mama hit me like the brick I only thought I could handle. The official front. I don't remember the exact time I lost consciousness after PFC Dawn passed, but I remember meeting 1st Platoon scouts from Camp Hope who helped me haul the body of Dawn up the steep and winding path to the camp proper. There, on a little overlook of the Colorado on the east end of Camp Hope, we dug a hole for the young PFC and marked his grave. There weren't any ceremonial or burial flags at Camp Hope at the time, so the flag of the fortification itself was brought down. The troopers who helped me lowered the body of Dawn into the little hole because I couldn't emotionally or physically do it myself. I found myself unable to move as I kept seeing his face and hearing "Where's my mom?" over and over. It all felt like too much when the flag was draped across his body, not long enough to completely cover him, and the troopers started shoveling dirt on top. When it was all over, a trooper handed me a marker, asking if I wanted to write anything on his grave post, but I couldn't think of anything for the life of me. I just hung his tags over the post and wrote his name. A simple sentence I'd been repeating in my mind hit me, and I added, "He didn't deserve that." Then, that was that. Morning revealed that Nelson was being patrolled by Legion beneath a mile-high black cloud, so retrieving any of the other fallen was out of the question. PFC Dawn was the first proud serving NCR man to be buried at what would later be a mass grave in the frontline base not yet called Camp Forlorn Hope. Just like him, all those who'd later be buried beside him didn't deserve the sort of end they'd get. There wasn't much for the few survivors from 1st and 2nd Platoon to do as we watched Nelson. Maybe 10 of us from 2nd got out, and it became clear that the 1st Platoon patrols prior to the rotation were the first ones targeted. With the whole company cut nearly in half, the platoon of logistics troops that stayed behind after the camp's fortification weren't enough to truly hold off another assault. Still with no relief from McCarran, that first day was spent with everyone on watch. All guns were focused on Nelson, and other survivors from 2nd Platoon had their own accounts of what happened. Most survivors were like me, and Dawn, formerly, acting simple perimeter control on the non-Legion focused sides of town. Although, one guy said that there weren't too many of them. Maybe it was just too dark for everyone. But things puzzled us when we saw the giant force of Crimson march into Nelson from the south shortly after burying Dawn. Captain Palatli had all guns focused on Nelson, as the large force of Legion troops dispersed throughout the town. Most of the fellas to my left and right were scared by the show of force, and so was I. Some looked down their sights at Nelson and shouted things like, "Just finish us off, you god-darn slavers." I suppose I didn't have enough actual knowledge of the menace around Nelson, or verbal ability to swear, to think of any insulting shouts, and instead just watched. It was at the end of that first day that Palatli got word that the troops from McCarran were on their way to fortify the camp. I guess after hearing about Nelson, the commanders got off their behinds and did something. Still though, they were at least a day or two out, and the little crimson dots moved around Nelson just waiting. In the morning on that second day, our sharpshooters with the binoculars came to the line and told the captain, the only surviving officer from Bravo Company, what he was seeing. I didn't get the chance to see it, and knowing what the sharpshooters saw, I don't think I wanted to. The east end of camp overlooking the river had a point where they were able to see the stretch of Nelson leading to the Colorado. None of us on our part of the line could see, but apparently, the scouts and troopers on the east end saw the people of Nelson being forced to hurl themselves off the steep cliffs down to the river. Upon hearing that, I almost didn't believe it, but turning from my rifle sights, I saw Palatli's face. The horrific scene seemed even more plausible when scouts on our end passed their binoculars down the line for everyone to see the activity going on past the shrub valley. The activity going on past the no man's land. And at the opening in the cliffs to Nelson was our troops in brown and tan uniforms, or civilians getting nailed to wooden poles and hauled up to face us. Those posters and accounts from veterans back in Sacktown were correct again. The few captured troops from either 1st or 2nd were being crucified, and there was nothing we could do. For 2 more days, the 50-some troops who escaped Nelson or occupied Camp Hope watched the distant enemy, just waiting for them to throw themselves at us. Captain Palatli was busy with the radio, telling the troops from McCarran how to navigate the narrow passes to a wide enough opening in the shrub valley, since cutting through Nelson was out of the question. The day they arrived, most of my lads were either ready for some long deprived sleep or ready to take back Nelson. I'm not sure which I was ready for. The troops trickled their way out of the western cliffs, into the no man's land, and up the steep and winding pathway to Camp Hope, where they were met like heroes. The survivors of Bravo Company were absorbed into the relief force. I got a new sergeant. Captain Palatli was promoted over the radio to major and told to await further instruction. Finally, with a full fighting force, the two companies that occupied Camp Hope were told to fortify our position by a general wait and see. I had no idea what to expect, but I was simply happy to take my eyes off of Nelson and get some real sleep again. The little campsite project of blasting through the mountain was completed days later. A path to the ranger outpost north of us was clear, and the rangers there volunteered half their time with us to keep watch on the Legion. I didn't know too much about the rangers, except their dusters and helmets looked really fancy, but the other troopers seemed much more relieved about their presence at the observation posts. In the meantime, much of the large Legion force around Nelson had dispersed or stayed in the buildings, because there didn't appear to be as many as that first day. Some of the new officers from McCarran asked about assaulting Nelson, but the new major's orders were to stay put, fortify the camp, and radio any Legion groups departing Nelson. So, the ranger snipers kept watch, and we regular grunts were kept busy digging in. I honestly didn't expect so much work with a shovel when I joined the NCR Army, but I didn't mind. I again liked the idea of filling up sandbags, if it meant they'd be stacked and placed in interesting and/or strategic positions. I should have been an organizer. After the sandbags came the rolls of barbed wire, the stacking of junk, and foliage netting or cover. The Legion showed no signs of leaving their town at the moment, and the new major had us rotate in trench digging duty. Down at the foot of the steep path to Hope, we spent days digging a long trench line while another platoon kept watch over the shrub valley. Maybe 2 days into the project, the Legion turned out to not like what we were doing. Luckily, I was on the ridgeline trench, observation line, as it would later be called, instead of digging at the time, because a red wave began to approach us from the south. I was curious about why it took so long after the first trench crew broke dirt for the Legion to react, and thought about trooper jokes regarding NCR's slow reactions. I wondered if the Legion had lots of paperwork to file before military actions as well. That wasn't it. Anyway, the spotters and ranger scouts saw the thin lines of red spread across the no man's land fast approaching and ordered the dirt diggers to fall back. By the time the word got all the way down, the Legion was close and emerged from the shrubbery 50 yards from the trench line. We were given the order to pour it on them. That order essentially meant that we were to fire at anything not brown or tan until we ran out of ammo. The troopers down below had started fleeing the trench line or getting their shovels ready for alternate purposes, and the guns thundered left, right, and in front. 1 magazine, 2 magazines, 3 magazines, 4 magazines, and I wasn't sure if I was hitting the little red figures trying to assault the digging crews. Through the smoke and dust, I could see the first of the digging crew had finally reached the top, and the Legion was falling back. Some of the troops cheered at having routed them, but a patrol ranger on our end of the observation line said, rather bluntly, that the Legion doesn't retreat. Staring at the, quote, withdrawing Legion fellas through his binoculars, he cried for the sharpshooters and snipers to take them out. I couldn't see it from the confusion, carnage, and limited visibility, but the Legion troops were dragging some of our guys back to Nelson with them. The snipers did what they could, but the Legion was soon out of range, and we all mourned the soon-to-be-killed troopers. After that first real attack, Camp Hope's command ordered the continuation of the trench, and ordered a squad of grenadiers to the top of the observation line. I guess it was their plan to bombard the Legion with a half-dozen grenade rifles if they tried anything like that again. I soon joined the digging party, and stuck my shovel into the hard Mojave dirt, while another squad of engineers was sent into the shrub valley on their bellies to place mines and lay wire 100 yards from the trench. The Legion saw all the prep work we were doing, and almost seemed to ignore us. I liked joking that they had to get permission to do another raid from Caesar himself and fill out the right forms. That joke went over well with some of the troopers, but it really didn't seem like the Legion had too many plans on attacking again. The Rangers said the situation was unlike what they'd seen the Legion do before. For several more days, the Legion left us alone, even after the line down the cliff was complete. Aside from the occasional Legion squad leaving the town headed away from us, nothing happened other than more crosses being erected to face us. After days and days of no activity from the Legion, most of the wounded from that first raid were patched up enough to join the line or injured enough to go home. The officers at Hope began getting impatient about the Legion, and the troopers on the distant crosses were long dead. After a few more days, word came down to my platoon that plans were being put into place about taking Nelson back. Every trooper at Camp Hope was either excited to hear that or completely terrified, except me. I didn't know what I was. I thought those distant displays were pretty jack messed up and was ready for either staying put or moving in. I think the Legion may have had psychic powers or a radio bug, because the night before a volunteer assault unit was going to prod Nelson's defenses, something bad happened. I was paired with a ranger the night before, marveling at the sweet duster silhouetted in the moonlight when he saw something through his scope. I was west of the observation line, and paired with that ranger at one of the watch posts on alert duty when he commanded in a hushed tone, "Fire that flare," in the neat static voice of his gas helmet. I pulled the hammer back on my billet-assigned flare gun, aimed it at the moon, and let it rip. The little ball shot far out, ignited, and gently fell to the earth, illuminating a few dozen long shadows across the no-man's land. As soon as I saw them, the echo of an explosion cracked across the valley. The figures swarmed the trench line below. The guns in those trenches popped off, accompanied by the ones of the observation line, and the explosions of a dozen grenade rifles pounded the earth. Me and the trooper in the eastern tower fired our 4 flares within 6 minutes, showing a flickering hellscape across the region. It got to the point where the shadows from the no-man's land had met the ones in the trench, and the platoon on the observation line fired at anything that looked like a man regardless of who it was. As the grenade rifles and mines exploded across the shrub valley, and the carnage in the trenches continued, the valley was set ablaze. After my last flare shot, there was no need for more. A giant fire had engulfed the whole no-man's land. The guns on the observation line had halted, and the chaos in the trench withered away as the shrub valley burned in the night. Morning eventually came, and the land between us and distant Nelson was no longer a shady desert wash. The fires from the mines and grenades had scorched the land, creating a scary display of sand, ash, and death. The battle and fires in the night destroyed the previously scenic view, but the rangers and troopers across the observation line were happy knowing that there were less places for Legion attackers to hide on. Approach.